Welcome to the Great Basin Seasonal Outlook for February through May. Over the last 30 days, we've continued to see generally cooler temperatures across the Great Basin and very wet conditions, especially for Nevada, Utah, and the Arizona Strip. This also extends north into parts of Wyoming and southeast Idaho. The only areas of the Great Basin that have really seen below normal precipitation have been generally up into southwest and central Idaho. Since the beginning of the water year, October 1st, we've seen well above normal precipitation across the northern half of Utah, or the northern half of Nevada into much of Utah, down into Arizona, and then again into eastern Idaho and parts of Wyoming. Southern Nevada hasn't seen as much precipitation as areas further north or east, at least dating back to the beginning of the water year, and also central and southern Idaho still seeing some of that deficit with the precipitation. The snowpack, along with this well above normal precipitation, has been extremely good across anywhere from California into Nevada and Utah and Arizona, where the snowpack is above 180 to 200% of normal. Further north, despite the lack of above normal precipitation across much of central Idaho, the snowpack is still near normal or just above normal for the time of year. So all areas of the Great Basin definitely benefiting from the snowpack. Looking at the fuel moisture, along with the wetter conditions we've seen, we are seeing higher fuel moistures over generally the eastern half of the Great Basin, still somewhat lower over western and southern areas, but certainly nothing to be concerned with as we continue to have colder temperatures and storms move across the area. 100-hour fuel moisture and 1,000-hour fuel moisture showing the same thing, just really no concerns with fuel moisture heading into the spring months. Looking at our soil moisture with these wetter conditions, it's no surprise that the soil moisture is generally above normal across all of Utah into Arizona, and then well above normal into California, where we've seen some of these more significant storms as well. Soil moisture is below normal up north, up into Idaho, again with that lack of precipitation. Looking at our drought conditions, our drought continues to improve across the Great Basin, although considering the deficit we've been in the last few years, it is still taking time to really get out of these drought conditions. So we are still seeing extreme drought over parts of Utah, southern Nevada, and up into northwest Nevada as well, and generally severe drought elsewhere or areas of moderate drought as you head further north, especially into Idaho. We're seeing either abnormally dry or moderate drought. Looking at our drought outlook, the image on the right, we will likely see the drought persist across Nevada and Utah into northern Arizona. However, it will likely continue to improve. Further north up into Idaho, we will see improving drought, and actually some areas probably removed from drought, especially as we go through the spring months, and the pattern is expected to change, pushing that moisture a little bit further north. Considering our drought conditions, we will look at how our fire seasons are typically affected by our drought conditions. Looking across Nevada, this is a generalization for the entire state. The drought time series is the background, and you can see our areas or our years where we've seen those periods of very significant drought back in the early 2000s, and then from 2013 or 2012 through 2016, and then again dating back to about 2021. Those are certainly our areas where we've seen our most significant drought periods. The black boxes indicate where we see our above normal acres burned for Nevada, so generally outside of these more significant drought periods, so either where we're entering or leaving drought or in years that we don't have really many drought conditions, and that's mainly because of our fine fuel conditions. So some of the similarities we're seeing really going into 2005, coming out of this very significant long period of drought and then entering into a few years of non-drought. And then also 2016, 2017, that similar pattern. That's likely what we're seeing coming into the fire season of 2023. So we'll see how this plays out. We certainly have had some impacts in some of those years depending on the area. So we are monitoring a lot of those conditions. We see very similar conditions in Utah where our above normal acreage are in years that we are not seeing significant drought. Again, that's really attributing to the increase in fine fuels. And then similarly for Idaho, again, in those non-drought periods is where we see those more significant fine fuels and those larger fires that burn our bigger acres. Now on the flip side, in our drought years is where we see our higher elevation fires. So that's drought is both good and bad depending on how you are looking at it and what your fuel type is. So putting everything together, looking at La Nina, El Nino, we have been coming out of, or we have been in a long duration 3-year La Nina. And looking at the forecast coming forward, La Niñas where we have these cooler ocean temperatures in the equatorial Pacific. So looking at a lot of the models, we are transitioning into a warming period, going into the fire season where we'll likely transition to neutral, possibly even pushing into El Nino sometime later in the summer or towards the fall, but we'll continue to monitor that. But certainly all the models are pointing to warming of the ocean temperatures, which again has been something we haven't seen in a few years. So our weather impacts that we normally see from La Nina are typically wetter conditions in the northern areas of the Great Basin and colder temperatures and drier conditions down south. We've kind of seen a flip of that in the December-January time period where we saw those wetter conditions really pummel Nevada and Utah and largely remain central Idaho out of those heavier precipitation events. We are expecting to see a shift to more of this normal La Nina pattern where we see the storms targeting more of the northern areas going into the spring, but we'll continue to monitor that as we go forward. The 8 to 14 day outlook taking us from February 8th through the 14th still shows this continued cooler and wetter conditions for the Great Basin. And then looking at our 4-month outlook, again, seeing that shift of the drier conditions and warmer temperatures push a little bit further west and north into southern areas of the Great Basin as we go towards March and April especially. And then into May, we'll see how that drying trend that potentially could affect California and Nevada materializes. Still showing those cooler conditions up north, generally the Pacific Northwest, northern Rockies, and the northern areas of the Great Basin. And then that is again where the moisture will likely be targeted as well. So as we enter the fire season, we will be looking for these areas that will be turning from the wet conditions we've seen into the more drier, warmer conditions. So southern areas of the Great Basin. We still have well above normal snowpack, obviously, so it will take some time as we enter the spring for those conditions to melt. So that's something we're monitoring is how fast the snow melts. We could see some below normal conditions for fire potential in the higher elevations going into the fire season, especially over the southern half of the Great Basin. And we will be watching the lower elevations as well, that those will take also some time to dry out and those fuels to cure. So we'll see what happens in the growing season for the spring. Right now, we're still not expecting much carryover with the fine fuels because of how much snow we've had at both the high and low elevations to compact any carryover we had from last year. So we'll be mainly looking at new growth for the fine fuels as this pattern emerges going into the spring. So as we put everything together, right now from February through May, we're just looking at normal conditions, which would be low fire potential, especially for February, March, and April. Again, we'll be looking at the May time period to see if we are going to add any below normal fire potential for the higher elevations of parts of Nevada and Utah and the Arizona Strip. And then we'll be watching for that fine fuel growth. We have had years where we've had these big winters and we've seen very slow conditions going into the fire season because it does take so much time for conditions to dry out, and then the monsoon hits and it really shortens that period that we have any fire potential in southern areas of the Great Basin. On the flip side, we've had some years that we've come off a strong snowpack and seen significant warming in the spring to rapidly change those conditions into above normal. So that'll be something we'll be monitoring. A lot of caveats going into the spring, especially for southern areas of the Great Basin. That concludes our seasonal outlook for this month. Certainly check back over the next couple of months as we fine-tune this fire potential looking at the spring conditions.